here, and I will be your host. I am going to be keeping an eye on that chat and making sure that we get all of our questions answered. And of course, we've got Dr. Christian Kammerer, the museum's research curator of paleontology, who will share his expertise and share the scoop and let us know what new research is happening, why is it important, what does it all mean. Hello, Christian.
Hi, Laura Beth. Good to see you.
Hey, it's so good to see you too. Doesn't feel like it's been that long though, right?
Yeah. Well, we're doing it a little earlier this month
Yeah,
with the holidays coming up.
yeah. Well, I'm still excited, like really excited about our topic today. I think I think it will get everybody thinking about ourselves and like our behavior, right, as
Yeah,
humans.
for sure. Especially since we're, in this age of social distancing, it is, difficult for lots of folks, ourselves included. And, part of the reason that is, humans are such an inherently social species. And as it turns out, that is not that's not unusual for mammals in general. So today we're going to be talking about the evolution of sociality and its deep origins in the mammalian record. So I don't want to get too ahead of myself there, but we're going to be looking at social behavior in a very interesting and in some ways poorly known mammal group.
Awesome. Let's do it.
Yeah, so let me pull up some slides here. Um, All right. So first, just to situate ourselves in time as per usual, here we have our geological column with the oldest things on the bottom, the youngest things on the top. And as I've already mentioned, today we're going to be talking about mammals. And we usually think of mammals as existing in the Cenozoic era, the youngest of the geological eras, which is often informally known as the Age of Mammals. And certainly, this is the time period that shows sort of the broadest blossoming of mammalian diversity. So, all of the incredible mammals in sort of the megafaunal eras, the sort of the Ice Age, woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, those sort of things. These are all from the Cenozoic. We are still in the Cenozoic today, so all of the living mammals, including ourselves, are part of this geological era. But mammals as a group originated, much earlier than the end Cretaceous, the extinction of the dinosaurs. The whole of mammalian history extends back not just through the Cenozoic, but through the majority of the Mesozoic, with mammals originating in the late Triassic period, around 210, 220 million years ago. These Mesozoic mammals are generally, less thought of, less famous and well known than their Cenozoic counterparts. When people do think of them, it's usually in the context of these sort of little rat-like critters running around, maybe being chased by dinosaurs or being stomped on by dinosaurs, but as fairly minor and pretty sort of morphologically similar creatures. And this is not entirely accurate. It is true most of them were quite small. There's nothing sort of elephant-sized in Mammalia in the Mesozoic. But recent discoveries within sort of the past 20 years have shown that, the idea that these are very morphologically conservative is false. So discoveries have been made of things like of gliding Mesozoic mammals, of sort of swimming beaver-like Mesozoic mammals, and a whole array of burrowing and digging, sort of mole-like Mesozoic mammals. So when you look at the group as a whole, they actually cover most of the ecological diversity that you see in small-bodied mammals today. So indeed, there are there are mammalian morphotypes and ecologies that are not present then. There's nothing like a whale. There's nothing, like an elephant or a giraffe. But a lot of what you see in modern sort of rodents and small carnivorans and insectivores is already present in unrelated Mesozoic mammals through convergence. So there's a lot of ecological diversity in these Mesozoic mammals. And there also seems to be some diversity in groups that are totally extinct. So notably this group, the Multi-Tuberculates, or multis, as they're known by Mesozoic mammal workers. This is a very typical example of a multi here. Laura Beth, you have any guesses as to what this fossil is?
Yeah, so to me, it looks like an osteoderm, like a bony scale on or a bony scoot, kind of with spikes.
Yeah, that's not a bad guess. And this does look a lot like osteoderms you'd see in something like Triassic crocodiliforms or even some sorts of fish or armadillos. But actually, this is a tooth. So multi-tuberculate in Latin means basically many bumps, and it's very typical of the molars of these multi-tuberculate mammals that they have all these, tons of tiny little cusps over them. That's actually not the only unusual type of tooth they have. Most of the multi-tuberculates also have this enlarged premolar on the lower jaw called the plagiaulacoid tooth. So that is both literally and figuratively a bit of a mouthful. But the name means, so plagios means sort of like oblique in ancient Greek, and aulax means a furrow or a groove. So it means basically slanting grooves. And you can see that on that big tooth, there are all those sort of little angled grooves to it. And so this is an enlarged cutting tooth that very interestingly has shown up a bunch of different times in mammalian evolution. So they're most common in these multi-tuberculates, but they're also seen in some early primates. And they're also present in some mammals living today, notably some marsupials, like this rat kangaroo, whose skull is here. And you can see the plagiaulacoid tooth on the lower jaw there. So this is Betangia. That's a genus that is still alive today in Australia. And a lot of the diprotodont marsupials have these kind of teeth, even some of them being very highly specialized. So in the marsupial lion, which is a sort of a lion-sized predatory marsupial that lived until fairly recently in Australia in the Quaternary. You can see the teeth there have been specialized into these cutting blades, almost like the carnassial teeth of true carnivorans, so cats and dogs and bears and things. So another case of convergence. But the plagiaulacoid tooth was clearly, adding a lot of power and sort of to the slicing motion of the lower jaw. So in something like Thylacoleo, almost certainly used for cutting through flesh and maybe bone. Some of the rat kangaroos today are omnivores as well. In the multi-tuberculates, they're generally quite rodent-like in their skull structure, so they may have been eating, mostly gnawing on vegetable material or sort of fruits and nuts, but it's possible that they also took some small prey, sort of insects or even small vertebrates, and some of them were processing those as well. So there's still a lot of mysteries regarding the life and ecology of multi-tuberculates. They're mostly known just from isolated teeth. So that first tooth I showed you here, the vast majority of the multi-tuberculate fossil record is just isolated teeth like this. And that's actually true for most Mesozoic mammals. It's quite rare to find skeletons of them. It's mostly just isolated little teeth. And that is in large part because they are such small animals. They have such delicate skeletons. They would have decomposed and broken apart very rapidly. And only the teeth, which are covered in enamel and are much more resistant to degradation, even than solid bone, have preferentially been preserved in the fossil record. They have what we call a higher preservation potential in the animal. So you find lots and lots of Mesozoic mammal teeth, usually by what's called screen washing. So it's a technique where you just get a lot of soil or sand or whatever sort of sediment bears fossils. You just like bring back bags and bags of it from a field site, and then you pour all the sand into basically into screens of increasing fineness, and then run water over it, washing all of the sediment out and ideally leaving the microfossils. So this is the source of most of the fossil sort of mammal tooth discoveries. And this is actually something that we've been doing at the museum for a while now. And we'll be ramping that up in the near future. So with the announcement of the museum's acquisition of the dueling dinosaurs this past week, it's part of that is going to be this Cretaceous Creatures program of working with schools and educators across the country to do sediment sampling and screen washing to look for the animals that were living with T-Rex and Triceratops. We have tons of sediment from Montana that could very well be yielding Mesozoic mammals. So look out for that in the future. And it's quite likely multi-tuberculates are there because we know that they actually have a presence in the American West. But most of them are, only known from isolated teeth. So more complete skulls are known elsewhere and also show some other interesting dental specializations of this group. So this animal that I've shown here, Barbatodon Transylvanicus, is a taxon from Romania, from the Cretaceous of Romania, from the region of Transylvania, as the name indicates. And you can see that big plagiaulacoid tooth in the lower jaw. But then the upper dentition is also very interesting, specifically the incisor teeth at the front there, because you can see that they're colored sort of like a red or sort of an umber color. And that is natural. That is the original color of the teeth. So that's not just fossilization. And that's something that you do see in some other mammals. So in some living insectivores like shrews and some rodents, I've got the invasive nutria shown there, which is a big, increasingly large component of ecosystems in the American Southeast, but also in things like beavers. They have these red or orange colored teeth, and that's from sequestering the metal iron in the teeth to strengthen them. So these actually have partially metallic teeth, showing they would have been actually quite powerful, quite useful for gnawing in these animals.
Yeah, can I just say, sorry, can I just say that of all the animals that we talk about, the crazy big scary ones, this one, just that bite power and those strong teeth, I would not want to be bitten by something like that.
Yeah, I think it could give you quite a nip. I've been bitten by hamsters and like rabbits, and it's always been exceedingly painful. So imagine if also they had if it was metal and they had these slicing blades in the lower jaws on top of that. So yeah, even though these are tiny little animals, you can see it there just fitting the whole skull fitting inside a person's fingertips. Yeah, I think you would not want to mess with them.
Definitely not.
But we don't know, there's still a lot that we don't know about the ecology and the behavior of these things, in part because so much of the record is just these teeth. So there are complete skeletons of multi-tuberculates that have been known historically, mostly from Eastern Asia, especially in Mongolia. The specimen shown on the left here, Cryptobatar, is a beautiful articulated skeleton from Cretaceous of Mongolia. You also have these more two-dimensionally preserved specimens from China, but which show soft tissue preservation as well, like U-Batar there. These things show the fur and in some cases the gut contents of these multi-tuberculates, so giving us an idea of sort of what they looked like and sort of what they were eating. But these are exceptional cases. These are very sort of rare in terms of the global record, which is mostly teeth. And particularly like these ones we were talking about in Western North America in sort of the Cretaceous of Montana were historically only known from these isolated teeth or fragments of jaws and partial skulls. So which is why it was very exciting this month when a new multi-tuberculate assemblage was described from a famous locality called Egg Mountain, which is in sort of northwestern Montana. So this is a late Cretaceous locality. It's from the Campanian. So a little earlier than sort of T-Rex and Triceratops, but pretty close in time overall. This is famed for its dinosaur eggs and nests. So we've actually talked about this locality before in talking about dinosaur eggs on Old News, but this is where all of the babies of this duck-billed dinosaur, this hadrosaurid Maiasaura, were found. So lots of eggshells, some complete eggs, and also perinates, so either hatchling or embryonic Maiasaura, and then assorted juveniles and adults. So very rich nesting assemblage of these duck-billed dinosaurs. But it's not just dinosaurs known from there. So there are also, because it is such a high resolution record of sort of what's going on at small body size at this site, there are lizards, some invertebrate records, and yes, Mesozoic mammals known from this site. So the ones we're going to be talking about today were mostly found in this block here. So this is a representative block of matrix that you see from Egg Mountain. So this very light gray color, the bones sort of this darker sort of chocolatey brown in there. And what you should already be able to see is that there is a lot of bone sticking out, and that some of it is partially articulated. So you can, in the upper left there, you can see there's a skull of a mammal, and then sort of parts of the hips and legs of another one immediately below it. But what's interesting is that it's not just a single specimen in there. So the researchers who worked on this, Luke Weaver, who's a student at the University of Washington, and then his colleagues, they found that this block was full of a bunch of different Mesozoic mammals, which turn out to be these multi-tuberculates. And it's actually, they are across a series of different sizes, so indicating mammals of different age. So they all seem to be the same species, but this assemblage contains sort of multiple adults, and then the evidence of multiple subadult or juvenile specimens. So what this is indicating is that this is it's a mixed age, probable social assemblage that was probably fossilized in a burrow context. So for one thing, the number of specimens here is really nice because it gives us a much better idea of what the skeleton of one of these North American multi-tuberculates look like. It turns out it's fairly similar to what we've seen in the Mongolian and the Chinese taxa. So nothing like totally out of left field, like that some of these were the gliders or swimming forms, although certainly not ruling that out in multi-tuberculates in general. It seems to have been sort of a small, sort of rodent-like, rat-like animal. It has and probably would have been a digger. So both being found in possible burrows, and there's evidence of the arms. So that's another thing that we've talked about on Old News before. The evidence for digging, so to these really robust humerus, and then this massive olecranon process on the ulna. So that's the big sort of lump of bone on the tip of the elbow there. Giving a lot of heft to the ability to scratch dig. So reconstructing these as burrowing animals, sort of maybe denning animals, and showing that sociality in mammals actually goes back quite a ways. So the researchers working on this determined that these were actually a new genus of multi-tuberculates, which they named Filikomys, which in ancient Greek means friendly mice, basically. In reference to them seemingly having a social behavior. And in a way, it is an interesting and important discovery because it pulls back the origins of sociality in mammals quite a ways. So we know even these early Mesozoic mammals, multi-tuberculates in some ways considered like somewhat primitive Mesozoic mammals, already had social structures, possibly complex social structures, comparable to what we would see in a lot of modern mammals. But also this in other ways, this sort of like fills in an expected gap in the history of sociality in the broader mammalian group, the stem group, the synapsids. Because we know when you go all the way back to the pre-mammalian synapsids in the Triassic and even the Permian, you do get evidence that these animals were living in burrows, sometimes also in mixed age assemblages in groups like cynodonts. We have evidence of animals like Trirachidon and also Thrinaxodon, which is shown here, living in mixed age, possibly social assemblages. Also, coexisting with entirely other species. This is the famous specimen of a Thrinaxodon preserved with this amphibian Brumastega in a burrow from South Africa in the Triassic. So going all the way back even to the earliest sort of mammal-like synapsids. There's evidence for sociality and den sharing. So this seems to be a consistent feature of mammalian evolution from the end of the Paleozoic through the Mesozoic, and of course right today into the Cenozoic. So mammals and our ancestors, we always have had a big social component, I think, to the lifestyles of many of our species.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that is really, really cool. And I just wanted to show you all, just to help you appreciate, scientific illustrators and the work that they do. This is my Filikomys that I drew yesterday. I asked Christian to explain to me what it looked like before he told me about it. So yeah, the work that they do is really amazing. And I have some questions. So let's see. And everyone, feel free to type your questions into the chat at any time if you want to learn more, if you have something that you're really curious about. So how likely are we to find evidence of social behavior in other types of prehistoric mammals? Like, do you think that the evidence of social behavior just fossilizes a lot better in these creatures because they burrowed? And then besides finding like groups of fossils all together, or a group of, the same species of fossils all together, is there any other evidence for sociality that we can look for? Like, is there a correlation between brain size and sociality? Anything like that we can look for?
Sure. Yeah. So it's very difficult. These sorts of behavioral inferences are some of the hardest things to suss out about the fossil record. So much of what we do as paleontologists is well-informed guesswork to begin with, and then being able to go from, trying to reconstruct sort of just what an animal looked like to how it actually lived and behaved can be very tough. So the burrowing animals certainly, I think, have a better fossil record in terms of evidence for sociality, because when you do get these things cohabiting in dens, it is it's an easy avenue for fossilization, because if the den is filled with mud or sand or something and all these animals die at the same time, you sort of preserve a snapshot of how they were living. There is, of course, the possibility that like different animals could be washed into a hole together. But in some cases, like with some of these Triassic cynodonts, they're so deep into the burrows, it seems very unlikely. Whereas especially larger animals on the surface, I think sort of what we call taphonomic processes, which are sort of those things that happen after an animal dies, some of the geological and preservational processes associated with them. There's a lot more potential sources of misleading us. So if you have sort of several dinosaur skeletons together, you don't know that they actually were living together. They could have, died and sometimes, far apart and just been washed together by a flash flood, or just sort of floating along a river or something. So and it's being able to infer interactions between them is very tough with just the body fossil record, which is why a lot of the behavioral inferences for big things like, dinosaurs, like woolly mammoths, stuff like that, has been based more on the ichnological record, which is the footprint and trackway record. So if you see, for example, multiple, like lots of tracks of the same shape, so presumably the same species, but of different sizes on the same bedding plane, so that means they were all put down at the same time on the same sort of like stretch of mud or sand. That is some better evidence for like herding, for instance, in something like dinosaurs. Even that is not perfect, but certainly it's better than just finding like two dinosaur skeletons together as proof that they were as for some aspect of their behavior.
Right.
As goes your second question with sort of how can we infer sociality based on sort of morphological features of the animal, of sort of like brain size. Not really. Like there are, greater encephalization quotient, which refers to the proportion of the size of the brain relative to the size of the body. A bigger brain can mean more potential for complex social structures, sort of like social hierarchies. Certainly in the animals that live today that have the most complex sociality, that have what we might even call societies, like ourselves, things like the other great apes, things like dolphins and whales. Yes, they do have very large and complex brains. But I think it can be very misleading to think of sociality only within those terms. Certainly, there are lots of little sort of small-bodied mammals that have relatively small brains. It's also worth thinking that the animals that have the sort of the absolute most complex in many ways social structures, colonial insects, which are also sort of the most successful social animals anywhere in the world, have absolutely tiny brains and relatively quite simple nervous systems. So the brain isn't everything.
I like that. The brain isn't everything. And so, are there any animals that are alive today that are direct descendants of multi-tuberculates?
No, they're a totally extinct group. So multi-tuberculates, they lived mostly during the Mesozoic, during the age of dinosaurs, but they actually survived the extinction. So the Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction that wiped out all but the birds in Dinosauria. The multis did manage to get into the early age of mammals. And some of them actually got quite large in the immediate wake of dinosaur extinction. So there's one genus in particular called Taeniolabus, from the earliest Cenozoic that is, could have gotten up to the size of a large dog, so pretty massive by multi standards. They seem to have died out after that, possibly through competition with rodents. So there's been a lot of research looking at sort of multi-tuberculate decline and rodent rise. And that's another thing that's very difficult to test in the fossil record, whether competition is actually driving extinction, because we don't get to see the animals interacting. But there's a big body of literature arguing at least that rodents were basically doing what multi-tuberculates did better. They were filling those niches in ecosystems better than multi-tuberculates could, and so the multi-tuberculates finally died out. But yeah, they were around for a good long while though. From the Jurassic through the Paleogene.
Yeah.
There's another group that's similar to them that is sometimes united in this larger taxon called Allotheria, called the Haremiads. And those appear in the Triassic. There was actually a new Haremiad also discovered this month from Greenland, another interesting early mammal discovery. But the relationship between Haremiads and multi-tuberculates is actually still very uncertain and is currently hotly debated among Mesozoic mammalogists, whether or not Haremiads are the ancestors of multi-tuberculates or whether they are a convergent group. But one thing that is for sure is that both of them are totally extinct. So no living Allotherians.
Right. So they were living, around the time of dinosaurs. Were there predators? Did their predators include dinosaurs? And if not, who do you think was preying upon them?
So the best evidence we have for trophic interactions, which means one thing feeding on another, is actually for multi-tuberculates feeding on dinosaurs in a sense. So there are gnawing marks, there are tooth marks on dinosaur bones that match those of multi-tuberculates. So do I think that this mouse-sized animal was like jumping up on Triceratops's throat and dragging it down? No, absolutely not. Although that was back in the late 1800s, that was proposed as a explanation for why Triceratops has a frill, to avoid the weasel-like attack of tiny predatory mammals. That's
No
during the real sort of like wild era of dinosaur paleontology.
Wow.
So of course today we think that's totally ridiculous, but uh, there was a time when such things were proposed. But no, the gnaw marks are probably so they're if you look at a lot of living rodents today, they will often gnaw on bones. Rabbits will do this as well. They'll gnaw on bones, they'll gnaw on deer antlers that have been shed in order to get calcium. So calcium can be a very limiting nutrient for, well, for a lot of animals, but certainly for very fast growing small mammals like rodents that generally live pretty fast and try to reproduce as quickly as possible. Um, and so gnawing bone is a great source of calcium. So these multi-tuberculates, they were probably, they're these big dinosaur skeletons all around. So gnawing up some of those. Um, I don't doubt that they were eaten by dinosaurs as well, but if they're living down in burrows, they may have been difficult to dig out. A lot of Mesozoic mammals seem to have been nocturnal, possibly to avoid large predators like dinosaurs and other carnivorous reptiles present on the surface during the day. Um, so no, to my knowledge, no sort of like direct evidence of like, a dinosaur found with multi-teeth in its gut contents. But yeah, I'm sure they did hunt them from time to time.
Mm-hmm. So why do you think they, are social? Why is any animal social? I mean, I was thinking it might help protect them from, their predators, but you probably have a lot more insight.
No, I think that is good insight. So that's certainly one benefit. So if it's all the division of labor is always a sort of a useful aspect of sociality. So it's very difficult to be on the lookout for predators and eat and take care of babies and all these things. So, if you have either a family unit or even, just members of the same species in a colony, I mean, that's what you see in what are probably the closest modern analogs to these sorts of multi-tuberculates, which are things like ground squirrels or prairie dogs, where you can have one sort of at the entrance to the burrow that's basically on lookout and makes alarm calls if sort of a hawk is overhead or if there's a ferret around. Whereas others are, foraging for food or down in the burrow, raising children, those sorts of things. So that's sort of a later aspect of the evolution of sociality. The origins of sociality, it differs, from species to species and sort of group to group. Looking at the Sinodont record, it seems like just the overlap of multiple generations is one of the most basic steps towards evolving social systems. So that's true of invertebrates, of colonial insects. It's true of vertebrates as well. So rather than just, once you lay the eggs, that's it, goodbye. Any overlap between, having the children in the same, basically in the same place as the parents, and then getting multiple overlapping generations starting to build up a colony is something that works for sociality. And there are plenty of reasons why it makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary standpoint to want to provide direct care to offspring rather than to let them sort of just be on their own.
Yeah, yeah. You want to give them resources.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's super cool. I am not seeing any questions in the chat about this month's discovery, but we're going to turn to our Ask a Paleontologist form. So we have this form where you could submit paleontology questions at any time. And at the end of every old news episode, we're going to turn to that to answer some questions. So someone who watched our episode last month, we got to talking about our paleontology volunteers at the museum, and they just wanted to know, what the paleontology volunteers do and how to find out if they're needed. So I am going to put the information into the chat if you want to learn more. I don't know when volunteers will be allowed back on site, but Christian, if you just want to give like another brief overview of what the volunteers do, and if you have any idea when they'll be back on site, then, let us know.
Yeah, sure thing. We don't know when they're going to be coming back because of COVID restrictions. Have the state strictly limits who can get in and out of the research portions of the museum and the laboratories. So generally, sort of in more typical times, we have a large contingent, but are always looking for more volunteers, mostly in our fossil prep lab. There are some other ways volunteers can help out too, but certainly the most work we need help with is preparing fossils. So that's the detailed technical work of basically cleaning off fossils from the rock that when we collect them in the field. So using drills and saws and other little tools, or even just like as simple as a little pick to help clean off these fossils. And so it can be it's detailed work, but it can also be very, very calming, and it's also very exciting because you are often the first person to ever see the fossil that is emerging, even before the paleontologist sometimes.
Wow.
If there's just sort of like a cross section of bone in a block that we bring back, and then the preparator is sort of the first person to see, oh, that's a complete skull, or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, and so we have very skilled preparators, professional preparators in the lab who oversee and train potential volunteers. So you don't have to have any background in prep to take a shot at it. But yeah, unfortunately, so not happening at the moment. But hopefully, before too long into next year, as we're hoping things improve,
Yeah.
we'll be able to get back to that. So what will be happening is, even outside of that though, is these citizen science projects that can be done offsite, which will be ramping up over the next few years, of things like screen washing to try to find some of these small fossils. And why that's really essential is because although there is still more to be learned about, animals like Tyrannosaurus rex, overall things like T-Rex and Triceratops are pretty well understood taxa. They're some of the most heavily studied species in the fossil record. What we have a much looser understanding of is the ecosystems, the habitats, the other animals that were coexisting with them. So there's a lot of data to be gleaned from the microfossils that are at these sites where these big dinosaurs are being found. So that includes not only like adult animals that were at small size, like these multi-tuberculates or lizards or small fish, but also potentially information on juveniles of some of these big dinosaurs. So looking is whether there are a lot of very small, potentially baby T-Rex or Triceratops or hadrosaur teeth in these assemblages. Really give us a good idea of sort of what are the dominant species in these ecosystems, and potentially how are they interacting with one another. So look forward in the future to more information about sort of those screen washing possibilities.
Awesome. Yeah, and I put a link into the chat for that. And let's see, next question. If you could travel back in time to solve a behavior mystery and watch the animals interact, where would you go, and who would you see? Who would you watch?
That's a great question. There are so many fossil taxa that are so bizarre and enigmatic that it's almost impossible to choose. Like there are animals that are known only from a single bone that we still can't really make heads or tails of, and to know like what it was doing in that time would be incredible. From my very selfish perspective as a synapsid specialist, excuse me, my brain, like my first thought, my brain immediately went to go to the early Permian to look at Dimetrodon, because even though the skeleton of Dimetrodon is completely known and we have a pretty good idea of what Dimetrodon looked like, just the past 100 years, scientists have spent so much time, have spilled so much ink arguing over the function of Dimetrodon's sail, that to be able to just like see it in life and see what the sail does and then be like, okay, that's it, would satisfy me on like sort of a deeply personal level. So yeah, I'd love to see Dimetrodon and figure out sort of what the sail is going on there.
Would you ever want to ride on Dimetrodon's back?
I don't think you could. The sail is too, it would be too narrow. Yeah, it would snap if I tried to get up on there.
Yeah.
If we're switching the question to what prehistoric animals would you most like to ride on, early synapsids, one of the big Dicynodonts probably, because they're kind of lumbering creatures, and I don't think they would really try to shake me off or anything. And there's a lot of girth up there for even a tall gentleman like myself.
I think I would choose something that flies,
Uh-huh.
Barbatodon of some kind.
Yeah, I think you could probably, the the biggest pterosaurs are already, they're pushing the limits of like being able to hold something human size. But I think like Quetzalcoatlus you could probably manage.
Yeah. Although they didn't really fly like birds do today, right? Or did they?
Well, no, they did. So
They did?
like pterosaurs, I mean, don't have feathers because they have more bat-like wings, although it's just stretched on one of the fingers rather than all the fingers. But yeah, no, pterosaur is certainly capable of powered flight. The biggest ones probably less than the little ones. Just they would spend less time in the air because it's energetically costly, and may have been doing more foraging on the ground. But that doesn't mean they couldn't fly. So even the really giant pterosaurs would have been capable of powered flight.
Okay, that's good to know. That's my choice then.
Hmm.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Christian, of course, for sharing, sharing the good news, the old news.
Yeah, no problem.
Mark your calendars, everyone, for December 17th. That is our next episode of Old News before the holiday break. And let's see, if you would like to sign up to receive an email reminder before every episode, I have a little form that you can fill out. I'll put a link to that in the chat. And then remember, if you're ever sitting, on a bench thinking of some random paleontology questions, and you're like, I really wish that I could just ask Christian Kammerer right now. Just bring up that Ask a Paleontologist form and type it in, and we'll answer it. We'll answer it next time. So, thank you for joining us. And
Yeah, thanks everybody.
links are in the chat. All right, everyone be safe. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.